Right, I'm going to quickly respond to some of the points that Paul's made. That there's an essential point in there that I don't disagree with at all, have very little to add to. Fiscal austerity that we've seen in Europe was probably unnecessary in most countries, unwise in some, was based on ideological dogma that had no empirical support. Now, the lack of empirical support doesn't often worry either economists or politicians, but it can matter when you start doing rather excessive things like tightening fiscal policy on the assumption you will generate an expansionary fiscal contraction when nobody's ever seen one. So much of what we've done in the last few years in Europe has been wrong. But they're not the only things that we might have done wrong in Europe in the last 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. Now, the single market in Europe has actually been quite important. The single market was a mechanism by which trade and competition expanded. Prices were forced to be more common. We were trying to create an economic area more the size of the US than any of the individual countries. That's very wise. It's probably raised GDP in Europe as a whole by between 3 and 6%. It's enough. It's not huge. No. There's risk sharing involved in some of the things that we've done. The creation of the single currency was seen as the last step in the single market, removing the last barrier to trade and to financial flows. You have risk sharing when you have a single currency, and therefore output would be higher. And on the whole, if that works, that's fine. However, one of the design flaws that happened when we set up the single currency, one obvious one was the enormous enthusiasm of the politicians in Europe for creating it and allowing almost anybody in and not checking their own conditions. But much more importantly, financial regulation remained a national right. And that might sound an arcane proposition, but financial regulation and risk are related to each other. We don't live in the Arrow de Breur world where risk is exogenous. It rains, it doesn't rain, you buy a contingent umbrella, you don't buy a contingent umbrella. We live in a world where you change the institutions and you change the quantum of risk in the economy. And because you do that, you have to be very careful about the design of your institutions. We've got a problem in Europe, beyond doubt, but some of the problems can't necessarily be dealt with. What can we do? Well, in some sense, I'm less sceptical about the problems Europe faces over the next few years than Paul was. Yes, there's a negative output gap. You can either leave it to the market, very slow, you can use monetary or fiscal policy. Well, fiscal policy is constrained. You do have monetary policy. Monetary policy is being used. The evidence behind QE working strongly is very weak, and it may not work at all in an era of zero long-term interest rates. The deflation we're seeing in Europe will move away quite quickly, I suspect, in Europe as a whole, because oil prices have stabilized. Question we're being asked in the presentation, do we need to move towards full fiscal and political union in EMU? Well, if we did, I don't think it's going to happen. So we have to ask what else we might be able to do. I'm sure most economists know what the prisoner's dilemma is. It's actually quite fundamental to their understanding game theory. It's two people have done it, the crime. They get arrested. If neither confess, they get away. If both confess, they serve long sentences. However, the police offer them, if you confess and the other one doesn't, you get off and they suffer. Well, therefore you end up in the bad equilibrium. And the creation of bad equilibrium in games is always something one needs to look at. But the prisoner's dilemma is interesting because the way I've just described it, it's a pure utilitarian game. You look at the gains only in the framework of the what you get now. But if your reputation for a repeated game matters, you may actually choose not to confess. You may think that rule-guided moral behaviour matters. Now, the reason for mentioning that is there's been a very major transformation of politics in Europe in the last 70 years. After the emergence of Nazism, which one can see as utilitarianism gone mad, there was a resurgence of Kantian liberalism and Kantian ethics in Germany that was embodied in the German ordo-liberals. That's people who believed in rule-guided behaviour. The only way you can maintain a civil society is to have rules you cannot break. Now, you've got to find the rules you can't break. Fiscal policy may or may not be one of the rules you shouldn't break, but that's behind some of the views. The debates on politics on default are about institutions. So let's look at some numbers. These are 2009 numbers. These are debts in Europe. This is proportion of government debt held abroad in 1995 and then in 2009. We look at the UK, 20 to 23% of our government debt held abroad. There's something about percent of GDP. Sweden, 40 to 41% held abroad. Canada, 28 falling to 14. The Canadians are not in monetary union, and nor are the Swedes and the UK. Spain, proportion held abroad, 23 to 47%. France, 25 to 67. Denmark, 42 to 43. Denmark, is that an oddity? No, Denmark's not in monetary union. It may be linked to the monetary union, but it's not in it. Austria, 36 to 78. Now, there's other numbers on there, but it doesn't matter. The essential thing about that is monetary union changed something about debt markets in Europe. And it changed it in a way that may or may not be a particularly good idea. Now, we can look at another slide. This is foreign holdings of government debt at the end of 2009. There's other countries in here. Greece, 80% of, now let me get the things right, non-resident debt as a percent of government debt, that's the brown bit. The Greeks had persuaded people to hold nearly 80% of their debt, which was 90% of their GDP. The Finns had also managed to persuade, actually the Swedes, to hold a lot of their debt, but that wasn't an awful lot of their GDP. The Dutch and the Austrians had also persuaded somebody else to hold their debt. That's mainly the Germans at that point. So debt had become internationalised, not particularly in the UK, the US, Sweden. It's another thing the same. Japan, that's the one we should concentrate on, Japan. 5% of government debt is held abroad. It's 10% of GDP. So you think, well, bear that number in mind when we move on to the next slide. This is government net debt as of now, roundabout. I'm afraid the colours have disappeared, but you've got 2014 is there, 2015 has disappeared from the slide, but it doesn't matter. The Japanese have the largest net debt. Why does net debt matter? Well, when you default, if you've got assets, the people you've defaulted on ask for your assets. Interestingly, some countries like Finland, have I got Norway on here? No, Norway have very large assets that overwhelm their gross debt. So nobody's worried about Finland going bankrupt. They've got more than enough money to pay the money back. Why isn't it that Japan defaults? It's the country on here, the furthest up Paul's Laffer curve. Why doesn't it choose to default as compared to some of the other countries? Now, Greece isn't on here. The reason for that is by 2014-15, we don't know what we mean by Greek government debt as a percent of GDP. They've already defaulted on a lot of it. Why doesn't Japan default? Back up the slide. Well, if the Japanese government defaults, who does it default on? Its own citizens. So it might be the most sensible strategy for the Japanese to take. But it could also choose a wealth tax, or it can also choose higher taxes in general. All three of those are effectively equivalent. If we had full Ricardian equivalence, the population of Japan would be perfectly prepared to accept a default as compared to future higher taxes. They're exactly the same thing. We don't have full Ricardian equivalence, but the reason the Japanese don't default is because it's their citizens who pay. So you have to think, how do we set up institutions so the government has an incentive not to default, rather than set up institutions where the government has an incentive to default? Who pays when Greece defaults? Not the Greeks. Somebody else pays. That was set up during monetary union, and somebody didn't think about that when setting up monetary union. Why did it happen? We set up a single currency, but we had individual financial regulators. So the individual financial regulators had rules, but those rules came from Barrell. And one of the core rules was you had to hold capital against your risk-weighted assets. And for the reason we've just described for Japan, government debt in domestic currency was considered zero risk. Because if a bank holds its own government debt in domestic currency and all the debt's held domestically, it's not a risk. If it's a default, it's the government's fault. The government has to bail the banking system out if the government defaults on the banking system. Whereas if you've managed to get to a situation where sovereign bonds are held abroad with zero risk weights, you get a problem. Domestic holders of Greek debt probably had a more realistic perception of the chances of the Greek government defaulting again, because it's done it quite a lot. And therefore the rate of return on Greek government debt was rather higher than it was elsewhere in Europe. So what do German and French and Italian bankers think? Oh, market opportunity here, higher rate of return, we'll buy it. And the Greek population were very happy to get rid of it. So it's somebody else's problem now. We set up a market where we have incentives to do things. That market, those institutions change the incentives. If all Greek government debt was held in Greece, then the total quantum of risk in the European Union would be much less than it currently is. Now, we have to remember that. There might be some countries like Germany who, because of their history, although Germany was the last major country in Europe to default, 1948, because of their history, won't default under almost any circumstances. My country, the UK, has not defaulted since the 1660s, although at times government debt in the UK has been higher even than the Japanese have had. Why haven't we defaulted? Well, partly moral rules, partly if the government defaults on its own banking system, it has to bail out the banking system. If the government defaults on its own citizens, they complain. They'd rather have their children pay the taxes than them pay it. So how do we limit fiscal risk? Well, as long as fiscal policy is national, it might be better to do a simple redesign and say that government debt from another country held in your country doesn't attach a zero risk weight in the new Barrell rules. In fact, you should have a risk weight on it that prevents you holding it. So the government debt gets largely held by residents of the country. So the default risk is significantly reduced. You'll always get the problem that the northerners will be reluctant to pay for others. There's some reasons why the Germans might save. Now, if, for instance, Germans retire earlier than Americans, then Germans in a growing world have to have a current account surplus and Americans have to have a current account deficit, whereas the only way the Germans can pay for their retirement is own assets in the US. And in a growing world, that requires you have a surplus in Germany and a deficit in the US. Germans actually do retire 7 years earlier than Americans. That may be because there's so little to do in America that people have to keep working. Now, QE is interesting. QE and the banking union construction have been quite interesting because in both of those, the recognition of the prisoner's dilemma and the allocation of risks have been recognised, partly why they've taken so long. In the banking union, it's the national central bank that will have to bail out banks for the time being. The bailout fund is proportional to countries and is emerging slowly. What the countries without debts didn't want was people joining a banking union with an unlimited guarantee, and then suddenly the Italians, well, not the Italians actually, the Italian banking system is not the bad one, the French suddenly telling the Germans, oh, by the way, our banking system's completely bankrupt, we're using up the whole fund. Now, that was a risk. The Germans didn't want to take it. Banking union took 2 years extra. Quantitative easing. Quantitative easing is a very good idea. Government buys government debt, the bank buys government debt, puts it in its vault, government's covered. If the UK government defaults on its debt, the Bank of England loses the money and the UK government has to put the money back into the Bank of England. No incentive to default. If you've managed to persuade the Germans to hold your debt and you're French, I'd use France rather than Greece, and then you decide you're going to default on your debt, it's the Germans who pay. So what we got in quantitative easing in Europe is the national central bank has to hold its own national bonds. You can't hold somebody else's national bonds. And again, it's to reduce the risk in the prisoner's dilemma game. Suddenly, rather late in the day, European institution builders recognised the prisoner's dilemma was present and facing them forever, and that they might do something about that. Right, I think that's what I said on that slide. I'm not saying these are brilliant designs, but this is why banking union and QE have taken 2 years longer to construct than we might have expected. If you had been in a unitary state, we would have seen both of them very quickly. And both would have worked much more effectively. The reasons the Americans are recovering is they were able to move very quickly to reform of their banking system. They didn't have to rely on the fact you had to have the French being honest about the bankruptcy of their banking system before you could have a resolution of the banking system. And they also moved very quickly to QE, where you didn't have to rely on the fact that you might find the Italians choosing to default on their debt because you persuaded the Germans to hold much of it. It's a problem. If you set up a multinational institution, you have to think of the design early on, and the enthusiasm for monetary union early on in Europe was so great, I think there was very little thought about the design of many of the institutions. That's financial regulation immediately in terms of looking after financial banking systems, not surprisingly really. If you remember back to the 2000s, everybody was going on about the Great Moderation and how Taylor rules had transformed the world. I mean, I remember saying endlessly at the time, this is complete nonsense, and that you get ostracized from the profession when you don't agree with the majority. Now, that's never bothered me too much, but the profession has moved away from that and sometimes are forgetting. But we can redesign these institutions. We can either move to a united Europe, that might be politically very desirable, or we can move back a bit and change banking regulation to prevent some of the problems. And it might be simpler to change the banking regulations than stay with this very unstable system where you don't know who's going to play confess. That's the strategy in the prisoner's dilemma next. And therefore everybody's holding back and not doing things. So we've got to get over the prisoner's dilemma by either moving forward a very long way or maybe moving back a little. But standing where we are is going to be quite unstable, which I think is what Paul was saying. Okay, thanks.